There have been 3 years of negotiations and they're now coming to a head. The US is very much setting the agenda. It's part of its strategic rivalry with China in the region, and it wants WTO plus and US-style regulation for the Asia-Pacific region. So this involves things like extended investor rights, including the right of investors to sue governments, stronger patents on medicines, stronger copyright, and restrictions on the activities of state-owned enterprises. Now, our speakers are going to look at all these things in detail. There's pressure now on to finish by the end of December, and there's a ministerial meeting in Singapore immediately after this one of all the TPP ministers on December 7 to 10. And at that meeting, they're expected to do major deals or trade-offs and then finalise the text after that. But there are still some obstacles in the way. There are really major differences about all those issues that I've listed and some others. And there are strong national campaigns which have been pressuring governments to say no to the US agenda. The US Congress has also not got the trade promotion authority to actually pass this or any other trade agreement. So that's going to be a matter of controversy, and that will also be addressed by one of our speakers. So our first speaker is Professor Jane Kelsey, who's Professor of Law at Auckland University in New Zealand. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Pat, and good morning to delegates and friends. We thought it would be useful to discuss the higher level issues around the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement before dealing with some of the more specific details. So I want to briefly address the geopolitics of what is happening with this agreement. What is different about this from other free trade agreements that have been negotiated recently? Some of the implications of the integration of its 29 chapters and the particular pressures that have been put on countries seeking to join the negotiations whilst they are in process, and what we can infer from that about what would happen for other countries wanting to join once the negotiations are concluded. As Dr. Reynolds said, this is a very broad negotiation involving a significant number of countries who are a part of APEC. And the formal description is that it began with the P4 agreement between New Zealand, Chile, Singapore and Brunei, and others then joined and it expanded with the goal of setting the platform for an APEC-wide free trade agreement. That is not, of course, quite how these negotiations work, because once the US joined the negotiations, it became a US-led agenda. And the agenda was spelled out by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at the APEC meeting in Honolulu in November 2011, where she described America's strategy for the 21st century, which would have 2 limbs or pivots. This was to relocate America's influence and strengthen it in the Asia-Pacific region. Firstly, by military realignment of moving from Iraq and Afghanistan and re-strengthening its military presence in the Asia-Pacific. And the second pivot was the economic pivot to develop rules and commercial capacities for US economic interests through the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. The rhetoric in the US has been quite clear that the ultimate objective is to strengthen the US position vis-à-vis China as the ascendant power in the region. And so some of the provisions, which I'll mention shortly, are actually less relevant to the countries that are now involved in the negotiations than they are to the ultimate objective of setting rules that might discipline China. The countries that are now involved, if we move in a geographical context, are Canada, the US, Mexico, Peru, Chile, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Brunei, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Japan. And they already have many free trade agreements amongst themselves. So the commercial objectives are actually very limited in a traditional trade sense. If we are looking at issues of market access, whilst they remain very sensitive, they are not, in fact, the focus of this agreement. The agreement is described as a 21st century gold standard agreement that will reach further behind the border with its disciplines on governments than any previous has done. That means expanding some of the existing rules you find in the WTO and in FTAs, intellectual property rules, the investment chapters, and so on. But it also means introducing new rules or disciplines around domestic regulation, how they are made, what the underlying principles of light-handed regulation should be, the right of commercial interests to play a role in the domestic regulatory process and to challenge decisions. And so what is unique about this agreement is the extent to which it intrudes into not only what domestic regulations can be made, but how they can be made and who has the right to participate in and challenge them. And so that takes it into a quite significant new zone. And if we look at the 29 chapters that are being negotiated, and I say look at them in a figurative sense because unlike in the WTO now where texts are released, the texts here have not been released except for when they have been leaked. There has been an agreement amongst the parties that the draft text will not be released until the negotiations are concluded and the agreement is signed. And the background documents will not be released for 4 years beyond the signing of the agreement. If we look at the 29 chapters, very few of them are traditional trade chapters. Increasingly, the chapters have been expanded into new areas, such as chapters on state-owned enterprises, aimed to discipline those, very much geared towards China, but impacts also on Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and in fact, any of the countries, because they have not defined yet what state-owned enterprises are. A chapter on regulatory coherence that sets down the mechanisms and standards for domestic regulation and imposes quite extensive requirements on governments. A transparency chapter, and similar requirements in many of the other rule-making chapters such as TPP, intellectual property, and investment, and so on. And so if we looked, for example, at a domestic policy such as tobacco, the Domestic Health Policy Agency would need to be familiar with a whole raft of the chapters that would impose new rules upon them. And there would be mechanisms in each of those chapters to challenge what they were doing. So the impact in the domestic agencies is very significant and potentially very intrusive and burdensome. The status of the negotiations, as Dr. Ranald mentioned, is supposedly in the end game. Now, after 3 years of negotiations, these quite complex chapters are supposed to have reached the point where politicians can make a decision next weekend to conclude by the end of the year. Now, some chapters are at the point where there are some quite clear-cut decisions to be made. Other chapters are very controversial, especially the chapters around intellectual property and medicines, transparency in decisions about medicine purchasing, the internet and copyright issues, other controversial issues like privacy in the e-commerce chapter with the unrestricted data flows across borders, and a rule that you cannot require a server that holds data about your country to be located in your country. But the chapter on state-owned enterprises, there is no agreement on at all. Now, one of the concerns is that the politicians may make some decisions that are not related to the complexities and the problems with the texts because they have made a commitment to doing a deal. So what does this mean for countries that might be thinking of joining this club? The experience with Canada and Mexico and then with Japan was that in joining the talks, they were not allowed to see the text before they sat at the table. They were not allowed to make any changes once they were at the table to things that had been agreed. And they had to satisfy, as with accession to the WTO, every individual party and then the group as a whole before they could join the talks. And the consequence of that, similar to WTO accession, was that some countries demanded more of countries wanting to join than the countries at the table had committed to each other. And that was most apparent with the US, with Japan, where an agreement was made to a parallel track of negotiations. Firstly, around automobiles, not only market access, but a whole variety of rules around automobiles. And secondly, around a whole list of non-tariff measures, which included most of the measures that the whole 12 countries were also negotiating. So investment, intellectual property, state-owned enterprises, food standards, all of those areas would have to be negotiated separately with the US to the US satisfaction and implemented to the US satisfaction before the US would bring the TPP into force in relation to Japan, and separately amongst the group of 12. So the US could demand higher standards from Japan than existed in the whole pool. Now imagine that if they conclude the negotiations, and they made it very clear they don't want any more countries coming in before the negotiations are concluded because that will make it too difficult. What you will end up with is a classic WTO-style accession where what you are required to sign up to is what's in the TPP and any additional obligations that might be set by the existing TPP countries, especially the US, in relation to any of the rules in the TPP itself or anything else they might decide to add. And that makes it a very one-way process, especially because, as my colleague Sonia Reid-Smith will explain, there are no development asymmetry and flexibilities in this process. So if we are looking at an APEC-wide FTA, we are looking at a gold standard set of rules developed by the US in the interests, one of its corporations and two of its foreign policy, as an attempt to marginalize China and state-promoted development models, but also that will be pursued irrespective of what the domestic consequences for the countries are economically, socially, or in the feasibility of doing policy in your domestic domain because of the complexity of the 29 chapters and its rules. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jane. I'll just inform people who've come in recently that there's some material, written material on the TPP on the chairs to my right. If people are interested in that material, you can pick it up afterwards, after you've heard the speakers. Our next speaker is Sonia Reed-Smith, who's the legal advisor and senior researcher at the Third World Network.
Thank you. And I'd just like to add to what Law Professor Jane Kelsey has said in terms of where the TPP goes beyond the WTO rules. So as she explained, the text is secret, so what I'll be saying today, and I think what all of us are saying today, is based on the past US free trade agreements, as they have a very strong template. You can see what the US required from Peru, Chile, CAFTA is very similar all the way through to the most recent ones. Or it's based on the leaked texts. There have been a few texts that have leaked for maybe 6 chapters out of the 29 chapters in the TPP, or from news reports. And of course, this US template, out of their 29 chapters, for which we still don't know the names, even though it's about to be signed, we don't even know the names of the chapters, but based on the past US free trade agreements, we think about 6 of those chapters are about trade in goods. Let's lower our tariffs, subsidies and countervailing measures, address TBT, SPS, that kind of thing, dispute settlement. The other 23 are about your other behind-the-border regulations that Professor Kelsey was talking about. So, of course, where the TPP goes beyond the WTO is often in areas where developing countries have explicitly rejected these issues at the World Trade Organization. So, of course, this includes Singapore issues, intellectual property, and the rest of the speakers will be giving other examples, for example, on services and investment. But let's start with goods. What does the TPP likely to require in terms of removal of tariffs by the non-US TPP countries? The US typically requires all the countries it signs a free trade agreement with to remove all of their tariffs on all US products, except maybe one. Korea got to keep tariffs on rice. So this is much further than a European Union free trade agreement. Of course, it's much beyond what you have to do in the Doha round here. The US, of course, does not liberalise all of its products. For example, they don't give sugar market access to Australia. They give half a cow per farmer per year or something in beef market access. But they require the other countries to remove all of their tariffs on US products. And of course, the US will keep their subsidies. They will keep their agriculture subsidies, which makes the cost of their rice cheaper than, say, Malaysian rice, when Malaysia has to remove its 40% tariff on rice. So it can have serious impacts on food self-sufficiency and food sovereignty, which a number of countries in the TPP have as national policy goals. So in addition to the removal of all tariffs and the possible impact of that on your balance of payments, your tariff revenue, your infant industry protection, your farmers who have to compete with a flood of subsidized imports from the US free trade agreements also ban export taxes. And of course, most African countries, many Asian and other countries use export taxes today. You are allowed to use them under the WTO rules. In fact, even Britain used them to industrialize. Indonesia has used them very successfully to take its plywood industry from 4% world market share to 80%, 80%, within 10 years. But this is banned. Now, of course, they only ban it on products to other TPP countries, but if you have a country like Singapore, then Malaysian timber gets shipped to Singapore, they ship it to the rest of the world, there's nothing to stop them transshipping the stuff that goes to them with no export taxes. One country got to keep them on 3 products in past US free trade agreements since 1995. We think that the technical barriers to trade and sanitary and phytosanitary chapters will go beyond past US free trade agreements this time, and, for example, restrict the ability to have labels on packaged food setting out the amount of each item in the ingredients, and will probably restrict the ability to have health warning labels on alcohol the way that Thailand was proposing in terms of big graphic labels that are prominent. And then in the intellectual property chapter, of course, this chapter has leaked a number of times in the TPP, and the most recent leak was dated to the end of August this year. And in it, we see that the US is still insisting on a lot of provisions that go beyond the WTO's intellectual property rules, so we call them TRIPS Plus. They ask countries to join treaties that prevent farmers from swapping any seed they have saved. They ask for patents on plants and animals. They ask for patents on a new use of an old medicine, contrary to India's groundbreaking patent law. They're asking even for patents on diagnostic, therapeutic and surgical methods, something that is not even enforced in US law. They're asking for longer patents beyond the 20 years required at the WTO. And so, for example, we know that medicines, when they were patented, were $15,000 US per patient per year for HIV/AIDS. When the 20-year patent expired, that same medicine could be made by many generic companies, all the same quality, same thing, but with a different brand name, and they competed, and the price fell to $67 per patient per year, from $15,000. So the US proposal to have longer patents beyond 20 years, an extension in 2 ways, means longer at the $15,000 per patient per year price. How affordable is that for many countries? And of course, there appears to be no exceptions written into the leaked text for least developed countries, who of course do not have to give intellectual property protection at the WTO for as long as they are least developed. They have a right to a renewal of their transition period. If they join the TPP, they immediately have to give the full TRIPS Plus protection way beyond what developed countries at the WTO have to do. These longer patents, of course, and stronger patents also applies to inputs for agriculture, inputs to industry, environmental technologies like climate change. The US is asking for a monopoly even when there is no patent for 5 to 12 years on medicines. They're asking for an additional 10-year monopoly on agricultural chemicals like herbicides and pesticides. We know, of course, that agricultural chemicals can be 14% of the input costs for farmers, and if you have the monopoly version, it's 3 times more expensive. So then your farmers have higher input costs for seeds, for chemicals, for equipment, and they face increased imports from the US at the subsidized price without any tariff protection. Of course, there has been a recent news report that the US is offering a transition period for the TRIPS Plus on medicines provisions until countries become high income. So if you look at that under the World Bank numbers, that's about $12,116 US dollars per year of GNI per capita. What does that mean for the TPP countries? It means that 4 countries will get a transition period. For Mexico, it would be about 1 year. For Malaysia, 2 to 3 years. For Peru, 7 years. For Vietnam, maybe 18 years, depending on how fast it grows. For the rest of them, no transition period. There are many other TRIPS Plus provisions in the chapter we don't have time to go into. The other chapter I wanted to discuss was government procurement. Of course, here in the WTO, that is an optional plurilateral agreement. Mostly only developed countries have joined. In the TPP, we expect, based on past US free trade agreements, that it will open up the government procurement, maybe not just at the national level, but also subnational for non-US countries, because the US doesn't want to open their state government procurement. It will open them for the ministries that are listed, and you negotiate this. Your government may say, okay, we open one ministry who has a very small budget, and the US says, no, no, please open all the ministries, and then you negotiate, and you see what you get. For those that are listed, the procurement is opened for goods and services. You have to give national treatment to products and services and suppliers from all the other TPP countries, above a minimum threshold, which is likely to be $193,000 US dollars for non-construction contracts and $7.4 million US dollars for construction contracts. For the procurement that is opened, you cannot use offsets. And offsets have been a very important tool for development by developed and developing countries, both direct, like a local content requirement, and indirect. Please buy some other product of ours for balance of payments reasons, and so on. Not allowed. State-owned enterprises may also have to open up their procurement if they are a listed entity in the government procurement chapter, and that has happened to a number of countries in their past US free trade agreements. But state-owned enterprises may also have to open their purchasing via the state-owned enterprise section of the competition chapter. And there it is even more extreme, because if your state-owned enterprise is caught by the definition, we don't know what it would be, then it must open its procurement. There is no positive list, negative list. As soon as you are caught by the definition, you must open with no minimum threshold. Even the $1 contracts to the small and medium enterprises or to the informal women's sector, all open to products, services and suppliers from the other TPP countries. But it's not just what's in the chapters. There seem to be demands beyond the chapters. For example, we recently saw that there was a series of strong letters from US parliamentarians from both houses of Congress, a clear majority, saying that they are insisting on disciplines on currency manipulators in the TPP. They will not pass the TPP unless there are disciplines on currency manipulators. It's not yet clear what that proposal will be, but it looks like, based on one of the influential Democrats, the definition of a currency manipulator will be if your country has 6 months foreign exchange reserves large enough to cover 6 months of imports, and you have a current account surplus. So you are penalised for being prudent and having foreign exchange reserves so you don't have a financial crisis, and you are penalised for being competitive and a good exporter and having a current account surplus. So the proposal is saying, please move towards a financial crisis by eliminating your foreign exchange reserves and having a current account deficit, so that you are not a currency manipulator. If you are a currency manipulator, the US Congress looks like they will raise their tariffs on your exports, or they will intervene in the currency markets to raise the value of your currency so that all of your exports are uncompetitive to the whole world. That is the proposal from the US Congress, and if they don't pass the TPP, it will not come into force with respect to the US and any other TPP country. And they are very insistent on that. They are very strong. So it's not just what's in the chapters, but any other requirements by the US Congress. And you'll hear later about the other stages that the TPP has to go through, at which point the US can squeeze more concessions from the other countries in the TPP in one-sided negotiations where they have you over a barrel, both in the fast track or without fast track, and after that in certification. So as Professor Kelsey said, there is no special and differential treatment in a US free trade agreement beyond a transition period. And the transition periods, as you've seen, are very short, ridiculous, laughable. The US, of course, gives themselves a long transition period. I think it was a 20-year transition period, or 18 years before they removed the tariffs on beef in the Australia-US free trade agreement. Right, so they get 18 years, but they give Mexico, Malaysia 1 to 2 years before they have to implement the TRIPS plus provisions at the level of countries with GNI per capita of 4 or 5 times greater than theirs. So that is what the US model is, that is what is in the TPP as far as we can tell, and that is why we are concerned that it goes a long way beyond what is in the WTO. It covers issues that have been rejected by developing countries at the WTO, but now it comes in through the back door of a US free trade agreement. And for those of you who are interested about why would countries therefore sign this thing, we can talk about whether they actually get more market access into the US, because, for example, in the goods chapter, they will require, as they always require, the yarn forward rule. So for countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, the only high tariffs that America puts on their exports is on textiles and clothing. And for that, the US says, if you want us to put 0 tariffs on your exports, you must buy the thread, the yarn, from a TPP country, of which only the US produces significantly because they're the only one with a big enough market. And their thread is so expensive that by the time you buy the US thread, bring it back to Malaysia, sew it, send it back to America, your textiles and clothing are more expensive than, say, Chinese textiles and clothing, who still pay the high tariffs, but start with a cheaper thread. So it is not clear to me what the market access benefits are for the other TPP countries, given they already have free trade agreements with almost everybody else, and how they could outweigh the costs that are some of the ones we have listed, for example, even in just the intellectual property chapter. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sonia. Thanks very much, Sonia. We'll now move to our third speaker, who is Rosa Pavelli, who's the General Secretary of the Public Services International, which is the International Union of Public Service Unions. Thanks, Rosa.
Thanks very much for inviting me to this very important panel on TPP. In PSI, the discussion around TPP has been ongoing in the last 2 years, and is one of the major concerns that we have, because we are deeply aware about the fact that TPPs are shaping a new model of trade agreements that can be proposed as a tool to force all the developing countries, but I would say the major competitors on the trade scene, to join this new model and let corporates and business get more and more profit. But to let you know how can be the impact of such a kind of provisions that are included in the TPP, or that we suppose are foreseen in the TPP, I would go to the antibodies. And I would like to tell you a bit about the experience that on some of these issues we have in Europe. Well, the European Union is considered, or was considered, as the place with the strongest tradition of welfare state and with the highest protection of citizens and workers in terms of social protections. all publicly provided. But for this reason, the European Union is also the biggest market for corporates where to make business in health, in social protection, and in social care services. Just to give you an idea, a few years ago, establishing the rules of the internal market within the European Union, the European Commission let all the world know that just the health sector, the public health sector in Europe, is worth more than $100 trillion euros every year. Can you imagine how a big business that can be once you privatize the sector? This is why the European Commission decided to facilitate what they call the cross-border care for patients. But it was not at all aimed to facilitate patients to get better health care. It was, on the contrary, aimed to open national markets to the provision of services from outsider companies. And that started having some impact. And the first step was the emphasis on using PPPs, public-private partnership, in order to help private capitals to penetrate the health sector and the health market within the European Union. I must say that we must thank Margaret Thatcher if we now have the possibility to have evidence-based results on how much PPPs can affect the quality of health provision. Just to give you a small example, the national health systems in the United Kingdom went through a downgrading of all the quality of the services that was provided. They had to rely more and more upon the so-called project finance investment. But what happened in 2008, when the financial crisis exploded, was that the national health systems was completely without resources to fund its own hospitals, because the investor were the same banks that were going in bankruptcy. So it's a vicious circle that has been introduced, and PPPs is exactly the tool to go straight through the privatization of the services. Just to give you another example, in my country, the richest region in my country, the GDP is the double of Denmark, just to say the dimension of this region, decided some years ago to harmonize the role of private and public providers in the healthcare sector, establishing the same basis and being paid by the state, both providers. And of course, it was heads open to competition that will help the quality of services, but there was not enough resources to renovate public hospitals, so they opened to private investment. And the result is that there's not one dialysis services in that region that is not owned by the same German company who provides the technologies for dialysis. Where is competition, I wonder? Where is competition? And how can we counteract on the quality of services? So please oppose any kind of PPPs. Please exclude health services and social services from any kind of trade. I conclude with another example that was in this sense successful, and I think we must keep in mind. This is the example of the fight for public water in Europe. We have been struggling for many, many years to keep water in public hands, and you know that the major multinational that are targeting, that are aiming to privatize water come from Europe. Well, because we were able to avoid any binding rules, giving to the countries the so-called principle of subsidiarity to keep their own autonomy in deciding which kind of services they want to open to the market or not, we were able to maintain water in public services despite the decision of government, of national government and the European Commission to privatize water. This happened in Italy. This is now happening in Greece, where because of austerity they are selling all public companies. And the Constitutional Court will rule in favor of maintaining water in public hand, because we were able to avoid binding rules in public procurement and in trades. All this infrastructure is put at stake by bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. That was one of the major issues that we have to face with the Canada-European Union trade agreement. This is one, and the health sector will be the most affected if EU and USA will be able to conclude the trade agreement, and this is what is going to be proposed to all the rest of the world if TPP model will pass through will be successful. Let me concluding just saying that even if we are not sure that all the clauses that our colleagues have just explained are actually within the TPP, we must expose the risk. We must expose the risk and combat the secrecy of this negotiation, because it's only through the democratic participatory process of citizens and people that we can avoid the major risk in this process, and once again affirm the sovereignty of people over trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosa. Our next speaker is Zaria Zain, who's the Associate Professor of the Medical Faculty at Lincoln University in Malaysia.
I will just speak on tobacco and how it would relate to the TPP. Just a little bit of introduction, perhaps this is nothing new at all. Tobacco product is a very unique commodity. It's not like any other. It is proven to be exceptionally harmful. It causes serious death, serious diseases and fatal fatalities. It causes premature deaths, an estimate of 1 billion deaths in the 21st century. And it is a human rights issue. Even the smoke-free air is a human rights issue. And nicotine is indeed a proven addictive drug. Yet it is legal, and it is the only legal available consumer products that kills. And it has been shown to cause a lot of economic losses. This is from the Tobacco Atlas. It is proven to be causing millions of economic losses from lowered or lost productivity or healthcare costs. In these other countries of the TPP, I don't have figures for Brunei and Peru, however, but it adds up to millions of US dollars. And on top of the fact that tobacco is a very dangerous product, a very unique one, it is the only product that has a legal international treaty that binds, that governs it. This is called the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, or the WHO FCTC. And the WHO FCTC is an evidence-based tool. It is legally binding. It came into force in 2005. And currently there are 177 countries. And out of all the TPP countries, all the 12 TPP countries, only the US is not a party. However, the US is a signatory to the FCTC. And there is Article 2.2 of the FCTC that provides for parties to enable parties to enter into agreements with on agreements that covers tobacco products, provided these agreements must be compatible with the country's obligations under the WHO FCTC. And the TPP is certainly a threat to this obligation for parties, because there are a lot of conflicting provisions between the FCTC and the TPP, if countries are binded by both the TPP as well as the WHO FCTC. For example, I won't be going to all the chapters, I'm just picking and choosing, like the goods chapter. As mentioned before, tobacco is a scientifically proven product that if there is increase in tax of this product, prices would also increase, and it would be effective for reducing demand for this product in the short term. And the Article 6 of the FCTC requires that. But market access that requires reduction of tariffs and so on will certainly increase consumption of tobacco products, especially cigarettes. And the World Bank estimates have shown that opening of Asian markets to the US increases smoking rates by 10%. And following that, there will be economic losses from loss of productivity, from sickness, and as well as healthcare costs for treating of these tobacco-related diseases. In the provisions in cross-border trades in services in the TPP, it would be conflicting with the Article 13 of the FCTC, which requires restriction on tobacco advertising, promotion, sponsorship, including cross-border advertising. And certainly, when bans on such things is permitted, liberalizing the trade in services without taking exceptions to services relating to the promotion and marketing of tobacco through TPP would create deregularized environment that provides tobacco industry to new opportunities to exploit. They can freely advertise and promote their deadly products. Technical barrier to trade, TBT. There are many provisions in the FCTC that can be construed as a violation to the TBT. For example, Article 9 of the FCTC that requires the product regulation, where tobacco product contents and emissions must be informed to governments. Also, there are provisions under Article 11 of the FCTC on packaging and labeling. For TBT, it is required that we should avoid unnecessary obstacles to trade, and TPP will provide strong grounds for tobacco companies in the investor-state dispute cases. In intellectual property provisions, Article 11 is also seen to be a violation of Article 11 of the FCTC can be seen to be in violation of the intellectual property provisions of the TPP, where the tobacco industry claim that the use of graphic health warnings, many countries nowadays already enforce pictorial warnings, graphic health warnings on cigarettes and tobacco products, and it is seen to be a violation of the TRIPS Article 20. And Article 9 and 10 of the FCTC requiring tobacco industry to disclose ingredients is also seen in the TPP as a criminal penalty because it is seen as a trade secret being violated. Investment chapter, the TPP may negate the rights of government to effectively protect health of its citizens from tobacco harm, and the rights to regulate any entities that relate to FCTC provisions in response to tobacco industry actions that frequently identify possible loopholes in the new ways to get around existing laws. And industries had asserted their roles as investors in Southeast Asian countries and demand for their rights to be protected and request for a level playing field. And in dispute settlements, Article 5.3 requires for the tobacco industries not to be involved, and if the Commission can call for industry to be advisors, that would be in violation of the FCTC Article 5.3. And already, okay, in 2005, it is estimated that governments have to incur millions of dollars on average in legal costs paid in developing countries in protected invested state dispute settlements. For example, in Australia, this is very recent experiences. Australia is being sued for its effort to introduce plain packaging, and Philip Morris, the tobacco industry, has sued the government based on a bilateral investment treaty, saying that it is in violation of that treaty. Under the WTO also, because of the Australian effort to introduce plain packaging, countries like Ukraine, Honduras, Dominican Republic, Cuba, and also Indonesia has challenged this effort. There's also the case in Uruguay, similar case also in Sri Lanka, also the same thing. The tobacco industry is challenging government in its effort to protect public health, and recently also in Thailand. And the argument about the health exception that is provided in the WTO, it is a very difficult provision to meet, and it has been proven to be quite useless because 35 attempts only result in one successful use of this health exemption. So what is required is a total carve-out of tobacco from trade agreements, particularly the TPPA, and Malaysia recently in the Brunei rounds has proposed for a complete carve-out of tobacco from TPP. And I would just like to summarize that all TPP countries except the US have legal obligations under the FCTC to protect their population as far as tobacco is concerned. And it is all responsible government's duty to put the rights of the people over the rights of foreign investors. And it is very bizarre that marketing a product that is addictive and killing at least 50% of the consumers to be given any privileges at all. And hence there is a need for consensus to support the Malaysian proposal for a complete carve-out of tobacco from TPP. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sadia. Our final speaker is Melinda St. Louis, who's Director of International Campaigns at Public Citizens Global Trade Watch in the US. Thanks.
Thank you very much. As a U.S. representative of a U.S. consumer organization, I want to echo that we share many of the concerns of the substance of the TPP that have been shared on services, intellectual property, government procurement, and many others. And in my presentation, I'd like to share some additional thoughts about some of the investment provisions that were mentioned by the previous speaker, not only for the impact on public health, but on a whole range of public interest regulations. And then to share some important news that I think is relevant for other TPP countries about the process within the United States in these trade agreements and domestically, politically, and what those implications would be for other countries in the TPP or others who would consider joining later. As was mentioned, in the WTO context, it's been since the 1990s, developing countries have successfully kept Singapore issues, including investment, out of the WTO, and that has been a very important struggle that developing countries have waged. Since then, the United States has pursued expansion of coverage of strong investment provisions, including investor-to-state dispute settlement that was mentioned in its free trade agreements since the North America Free Trade Agreement in 1994. And that has expanded throughout U.S. trade negotiations. This has been a key feature of U.S. corporations and what they demand in trade agreements with the United States. The ambition for the TPP is to vastly expand this coverage for U.S. corporations, these extreme investor protections, and to lock in this very extreme model at a time when actually governments around the globe are actually rethinking this system due to many of its excesses, which I'll mention. In the context of the TPP, the definition and scope of what actually is considered to be investment is proposed to expand even beyond agreements from the past that the United States has negotiated. It would include regulatory permits and licensing, procurement contracts that would be related to infrastructure, natural resource concession contracts, and even market share or future profits. These are definitions of investment that go vastly beyond what people would typically imagine would be an investment. And it would cover investment that existed previous to when the TPP was signed. So it grandfathers in all of the investment that would be included. In the U.S. free trade agreements, and we've seen from leaked text from the TPP, that the investor rights are very broad in terms of substance. It's not just expropriation of an investment, but indirect expropriation. So this is not just a direct seizure of property, but it can be what is considered to be a regulatory taking, or a regulation that diminishes the value of the investment, even if it's applied equally to domestic and foreign firms. There's a very broad substantive standard called minimum standard of treatment, or fair and equitable treatment. These are very vague standards that have been interpreted increasingly broadly by tribunals and under the investor-state dispute settlement, and can be really considered a standstill on laws and regulations. That it has been the most successful claim that has been made by investors, and we have seen that this has been one of the most problematic provisions, which I'll mention in some of the cases that we have seen. So-called improvements to some of these standards that have been in more recent U.S. free trade agreements have not been effective in protecting states, as we'll see from cases. And in U.S. FTAs, there are no exceptions for public health or environmental protection. The exception that was mentioned earlier does not cover the investment chapter in U.S. FTAs. And that has been a feature, and we know that that's the position of the United States. They also do not have even exceptions for balance of payments crises, for different capital controls, et cetera. None of that covers the investment chapter in past U.S. FTAs. In addition to the extreme substantive rights, the procedural rights under the TPP and U.S. free trade agreements are very broad and problematic. The cases are broad. It empowers a foreign investor to enforce this public treaty, to sue a government for a measure that has been taken that they believe reduces the value of their investment. 3 private sector attorneys outside the domestic court systems make the decision of whether there's been a violation of the investor rights. The investor rights. Many of these judges rotate between representing claimants and serving as judges. We actually have a document here that outlines some of the outrageous aspects of the investor-to-state dispute settlement and the arbitrators themselves who have captured the decision making and have begun to interpret more and more creatively pro-investment interpretations of the provisions. This has been extremely costly for states. The threats can chill government action. The OECD review found that average legal costs are $8 million per case, and that's even if the government wins the challenge. They have to pay their legal costs. It's extraordinarily expensive, and the tribunals have discretion to award unlimited damages. This can include compound interest from the time of the alleged violation. The largest award was awarded last year. It was $2.4 billion, not including investments against the government of Ecuador, which is a very high percentage of the government's health budget to go to pay a foreign investor for an alleged violation. And these rulings are not bound by precedent, and there's no outside appeal. So this has been for this reason, governments have begun to rethink if this is really what they intended to sign up for in these agreements. We've seen an explosion of these investor-to-state cases since the U.S. has been including them in their free trade agreements. Between 1950 and 2000, there were only 2 cases brought a year under these tribunals. Since 2000, it's increased dramatically. This is UNCTAD data. And just under U.S. free trade agreements, more than $400 million have been awarded to corporations. That's just under the free trade agreements, not including the bilateral investment treaties. And there are $14 billion pending under those FTAs. I don't have time to go into the many, many cases, but we have materials that outline some of the very egregious cases that have been brought against governments that have related to toxic waste facilities that have been required to be cleaned up, and yet the polluter is then paid by the government, in the case of Mexico, $15 million because of an alleged investor violation of the North America Free Trade Agreement, toxics bans, other types of research and development requirements to support Canada's poorest provinces. Those were considered to be violations of NAFTA, and the investor was awarded millions of dollars. In other cases, even when they haven't gotten to the end stage, many governments have settled and paid millions of dollars, banning, again, toxics bans. And in the case of Germany, the regulations on a coal-fired power plant was challenged, and the settlement, they were seeking $1.9 billion US, and there was a settlement payment, as well as Germany changing their laws so that the coal-fired power plant could continue to pollute. So these are just some examples of how, of some of these cases. Ongoing cases have been used to derail domestic lawsuits against polluting companies or against companies that have been violating the public health of countries in order to disrupt those domestic court proceedings. Companies have launched investor-to-state dispute resolution. And many companies are using this to chill reform efforts, just the threat of these types of cases for small developing countries who might be facing mounting legal costs may think twice about putting into place regulations that would be a potential violation of these trade agreements. So for that reason, as I mentioned, there has been a groundswell through many different countries to rethink this model. However, and in the United States, there's been a groundswell of state-level officials, consumer advocates, labor groups, environmental advocates to push for a change. And in fact, President Obama, when he was a senator and as a presidential candidate, pledged to reform the U.S. trade model in this regard, and specifically the investment provisions as well as others. Unfortunately, the bad news I bring is that we have unfortunately, we have not seen a change in the Obama administration, and in fact, they've continued the same positions as President Bush, and before that, there was a review of the model, U.S. model bilateral investment treaty. It resulted in no change to the model. The U.S. corporations continued to push a very aggressive agenda in this, despite claiming to be wanting to promote more open government. As has been mentioned, the TPP has been the most secretive trade negotiation to date. And it's unfortunately continued to follow the wish list of Wall Street and of U.S. multinational corporations such as Big Pharma and so forth, despite the lessons that we should have learned from the financial crisis, from past trade agreements. And we've unfortunately seen the bad old days of kind of what has been described as U.S. bullying continuing in the context of the TPP negotiations, with very recent heavy-handed negotiating tactics, exhausting other partners through very long negotiating sessions, controlling the agenda and so forth. And it's been a big disappointment for those of us who have been promoting change in the United States. To mention, but it's important, I think, for other countries to understand that in the United States we do have a kind of a unique system in terms of negotiating and signing trade agreements. In the United States we have a separation of powers between our legislative branch and executive branch. That Congress actually has the exclusive authority over the substance of trade agreements. And so in order for the executive branch to negotiate agreements and sign them, Congress delegates its authority. There were several different ways that Congress has delegated its authority, maintaining a level of direct involvement in the negotiations. But in the 1970s, President Nixon cooked up this fast-track trade authority, which was anomalous. It's a very extreme delegation of Congress's authority, which allows the executive to sign the agreement before Congress approves, allows the executive to write implementing legislation, allows the executive to control the congressional calendar, to force a vote, etc. And in the United States, that's a very extreme delegation of authority. As I mentioned, that this has been a very, that the separation of powers in the United States is a very critical feature of our system. So any time that the President has requested fast track in recent years, it's been a very major legislative fight. And it's important for everyone to know that fast track expired in the United States in 2007. The Obama administration does not have authority from Congress to be negotiating the agreement under these types of very these rules that tie Congress's hands. So in fact, President Bill Clinton, who is considered to be one of the free trade presidents of the United States, the WTO and NAFTA came in, under his leadership, he was denied fast track by Congress 6 of his 8 years in office, right after the WTO and NAFTA were implemented because of outrage from the U.S. Congress. And so despite the serious intention to secure fast track from the U.S. Congress since the beginning of this year, already 3 years into the TPP negotiations, legislation has not even been introduced. It's a very remote possibility, and that legislation will be introduced before the end of this year, despite the fact that the U.S. is claiming to want to conclude the TPP negotiations before the end of this year. There are only 4 days left that the House and Senate are in office together before the end of the year, and legislation has not been introduced. Even once legislation is introduced, it typically takes over a year. For President Bush, it took more than 2 years once legislation was introduced. So it is very unlikely that the administration will be granted fast track anytime soon, even in this Congress. There are quite a few reasons for this. The first, a growing number of members of Congress have become outraged by both the process of the TPP negotiations and the substance.
Many who supported free trade agreements in the past have written angry letters to the administration. Just a couple of weeks ago, 166 Democrats sent different letters. 151 signed this one to the president saying they would deny fast track. These are members of the president's own party because of their frustration around issues of many things that are both in the agreement and issues that are not in the agreement. Many members are concerned about the impact on affordable medicines, internet freedom, financial regulation, investment. There is, as Sonia mentioned, I'll get to that in a second. I also wanted to mention that the concern around many pro-free trade members of Congress have been opposed to this fast track and TPP because of the process. Senator Wyden, who's the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, was very concerned about the secrecy of the TPP. They have been locked out of these negotiations in a way that they have not been in the past, and so they're very upset about it. And the Republican Party, which controls the House of Representatives, many of the Tea Party Republicans are very concerned and opposed to fast track for constitutional reasons. They consider it to be a power grab by Obama. They do not like Obama and are not inclined to grant him any authority, and so are unlikely to do so under fast track. And this reflects public opinion in the United States. It may be a surprise to other countries, but actually polling data shows that one of the only issues that unites Republicans, Democrats, and independents is opposition to this type of model of free trade agreement in the United States. So it's only through tying Congress's hands that they can get this through. And they are not going to have fast track anytime soon. As I mentioned, the key issues of congressional opposition, one of the key ones that Sonia mentioned is that currency manipulation disciplines are being demanded by Congress. This so far has been ignored by the U.S. Trade Representative in the context of the TPP negotiations. These are veto-proof majorities in the United States. And I'm going to rob a couple minutes to mention what the implications for other TPP countries are because of this. When USTR has ignored Congress's demands on transparency and also on substance in the past, historically, trade agreement implementation has been very severely delayed and has required additional concessions by countries after the agreement has been signed. Even under fast track, the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, it was a requirement. U.S. trade negotiators typically downplay the role of Congress, but for instance, under this U.S. free trade agreement with Korea, they ignored congressional demands related to automobile and auto parts. And 3 years after the agreement was signed in 2007 by the Bush administration, it became obvious that even with fast track in place, the FTA would not be supported by a majority of House of Representatives. And both chambers of Congress must approve all the trade agreements. So under the Obama administration, U.S. negotiators demanded additional concessions from Korea. Korea ultimately provided them, and the FTA was finally passed in 2011. And so that was even after fast track. So those 4 years and additional concessions made after it was implemented. Without fast track, normal congressional procedures would apply, and U.S. trading partners have been insistent that without the greater uncertainty of U.S. congressional approval of fast track, they're not inclined to make politically sensitive concessions to the U.S. Because without fast track, Congress, not the executive, would write the implementing legislation, and in the House of Representatives, any committee chair, and in the Senate, any individual senator who's unhappy with a term of the agreement can indefinitely hold up the process and require additional concessions before the agreement would be passed. And even if the legislation passes in both chambers of Congress and the legislation is signed, as Sonia mentioned, there's another way that the U.S. has extracted additional concessions from trading partners. The implementing legislation in recent U.S. STAs has required that the President withholds formal written notification that the U.S. has completed its legal requirements to implement the FTA until the President certifies that a trade partner has altered its domestic laws and policies to satisfy U.S. expectations of that country's FTA compliance. So some countries that have negotiated FTAs with the U.S. have experienced this certification process and has meant making additional concessions later on. For example, in the U.S.-Peru Free Trade Agreement, it was signed in April 2006. The Peruvian Congress ratified it in 2006 in June, and the U.S. Congress approved it in December 2007. However, the FTA only entered into force 2 years later, in 2009, after the United States certified that Peru had altered its various intellectual property, labor, environmental, and other laws to meet the U.S. specifications. In other case, in the case of Guatemala, a document surfaced to show that the U.S. had sent specific language in Spanish to the Guatemalan government for legislation that they needed to pass before before they certified compliance. And so it's important for TPP countries to understand this, particularly as these negotiations enter what are considered to be this end game. And just to conclude, as a U.S. consumer organization, we've been strongly advocating for a different process and framework for promoting fair trade between the U.S. and other countries. And while, as I mentioned, polls show that the majority of the U.S. is unhappy with this model, and that members of the U.S. Congress do not support some of these extreme WTO plus agenda of the U.S. corporate interests. So therefore, unless the process opens up to allow robust public debate of proposals in the TPP and fairer deal emerges that creates benefits for workers and consumers in all TPP countries, we believe it would be inappropriate for parties to conclude these talks anytime soon. Thank you.